On September 12, 1889, Elizabeth Corley stepped down from the mail coach at Baker City, Oregon, wearing a traveling dress of dark gray wool and holding a leather valise sealed with a small brass lock. She carried nothing else. A trunk had been sent ahead by rail 3 weeks earlier and now waited at the Halton place, 40 miles east, in the lee of the Elkhorn Mountains. She was 34 years old. Her hair was the color of dry pine straw, gathered neatly beneath a modest bonnet. Her eyes were gray and level. She had been widowed 5 times in 11 years, and she said so plainly to any woman who asked. She did not embellish. She did not weep. She said only that Providence had asked much of her, and that she had learned to travel light. Edward Halton had not come to meet the coach. He had sent instead a hired man named Bram, a lean Basque with a graying mustache who spoke little and drove the wagon at a considered pace. The road climbed through sage and juniper. Elizabeth watched the country pass with the calm attention of a woman who had already seen most of it in one form or another. Missouri, Nebraska, Indiana, Kansas, Iowa. She had married a man in each and buried a man in each and moved on before the neighbors could learn her face too well. She meant to try harder in Oregon. She was, she believed, growing tired. The Halton Ranch sat in a wide draw at the foot of a bare ridge, with a 2-story frame house painted white and a barn with a cedar shingle roof. There were sheep on the far slope and a windmill turning slowly against a pale afternoon sky. The house had a porch with a swing on it. Someone had planted foxglove along the front walk, a tall run of it, purple and pink, still blooming in the last warmth of the year. Elizabeth studied that detail for a long moment before she stepped down from the wagon. Edward came out of the house with his hat in his hand. He was 51. He was tall. He had the composed, sun-lined face of a man who had been left alone with his thoughts too long and had made peace with them. He did not smile. He extended his hand. "Mrs. Corley," he said. "Mr. Halton, you had a good journey. I had a long one." He did not press her further. He carried her valise inside himself. He showed her the parlor, where a coffee service had been set out on a lace cloth, and the small room off the kitchen he had prepared as her own for the weeks before the wedding. The room had a window that faced east, a single chair, a vase of dried yarrow on the dresser. Everything had been placed with a quiet, deliberate hand. "The Reverend Halstead can come on Saturday," Edward said. "If that suits you." "Saturday suits me." He nodded once. He looked at her for a fraction longer than a stranger should. Then he went out to see about the horses. Alone, Elizabeth removed her bonnet and laid it on the bed. She crossed to the dresser and lifted the vase of yarrow and turned it slowly in her hands. Yarrow, in her mother's time, had been called soldier's woundwort. It stanched bleeding. In stronger doses, it thinned the blood. She set the vase down carefully and went to unpack. They were married on Saturday, the 21st of September, in the front parlor of the house. The Reverend Halstead was a tall, stooped man with a red face and an old prayer book that had crossed the plains twice. He read the service quickly, as if he had somewhere else to be. Bram stood as witness. So did a neighbor woman named Mrs. Dell, who lived 4 miles west and had brought a plate of dried apple cake covered in a clean napkin. Elizabeth wore a dress of pale dove gray silk, plain at the collar, buttoned high. She had bought it in St. Louis 3 husbands ago and altered it twice since. Edward wore a black coat and a starched white shirt. He said his vows in a low, steady voice, without looking away from her face. When he slid the ring onto her finger, his hand did not tremble. She noted this. Most men's hands trembled. Afterward, Mrs. Dell embraced her and said she was glad Edward had found a companion at last, that he had been too long alone in that house, and that a woman's touch would settle him. Elizabeth thanked her and said she hoped so. She held the older woman's hand a moment longer than necessary and asked after her family. Mrs. Dell had 3 grown sons and a husband with a bad back. Elizabeth remembered every name. She always did. The Reverend and the Dells left before dark. Bram went to the bunkhouse. Elizabeth and Edward were alone in the White House for the first time, as husband and wife. Edward built up the fire in the parlor stove. He set the coffee pot on. He did not speak while he worked, and Elizabeth found she did not mind the silence. She sat in the wing chair with her hands folded and watched him move. He had the economy of a man who had done every small chore in his own kitchen for many years and had no wasted motions left in him. "Mrs. Halton," he said at last, testing the name. "Yes, there is coffee. There is also a bottle of Madeira in the sideboard if you prefer. Coffee is fine." He poured 2 cups and brought them across the room and set hers on the small table at her elbow. Then he sat opposite her, not on the settee but in a straight chair he had drawn up for the purpose, as if a formal distance still applied. "I want you to know," he said, "that I do not expect anything from you tonight that you are not prepared to give. This house is large. There are 2 upstairs rooms. You may choose either." Elizabeth studied him over the rim of her cup. In her experience, men did not say such things. Men who said such things wanted credit for saying them. Edward's face held no expectation of credit. He looked, instead, like a man reading aloud from a list he had drafted carefully some days earlier. "That is generous of you," she said. "It is practical. We are strangers." Yes, strangers do not become otherwise by the calendar. She set her cup down. "You are an unusual man, Mr. Halton. I have had a great deal of time to consider what a marriage ought to look like." He paused. "The last one taught me. You were widowed in 1873. That is a long time." 16 years. He looked into his cup. "I did not remarry sooner because I did not find, until recently, a woman whose circumstances suggested she might understand mine." Elizabeth held very still. Outside, the wind moved through the foxglove along the walk. Somewhere in the barn, a horse shifted in its stall. "I hope I understand them," she said carefully. Edward smiled for the first time that day. It was a small smile, thin and closed, and it did not reach his eyes. "I hope so as well." She took the east room upstairs. It had a narrow bed with a white counterpane, a washstand, and a wardrobe of dark walnut. Edward took the west room across the landing. He wished her a good night at the top of the stairs and did not linger. She heard his door close, and then, some minutes later, the small sounds of a man preparing for sleep in a house where sleep had been a solitary business for a long time. Elizabeth did not sleep. She sat on the edge of the bed and considered what he had said in the parlor. 16 years. 1873. A widow whose circumstances suggested she might understand. Any woman in her situation would have heard it and grown wary. Elizabeth was not any woman. She had spent a decade reading men the way a horse trader reads teeth, and she was practiced enough to know when a sentence had been rehearsed. Edwards had. He had chosen the words carefully and offered them at the moment of his choosing, and he had watched her face when he said them. She was not frightened. She did not think yet that she needed to be. But she filed the sentence away in the small, orderly compartment she kept for details that did not fit, and she resolved to look at the house properly by daylight. The next morning, she rose before Edward and went down to the kitchen and made breakfast. She fried salt pork and made biscuits from scratch and put on coffee. When he came down, dressed and shaven, he stood in the doorway a moment and looked at her at his stove. "You did not have to. I wish to. Thank you." They ate together at the kitchen table. He asked her, courteously, about her preferences. Did she take her coffee with cream? Did she prefer the parlor stove kept lit through the afternoon? Was there any furniture she would like moved? Any linen she found wanting? Elizabeth answered each question with corresponding care. It was, she thought, like 2 people negotiating the terms of a long treaty, with the language of tablecloths standing in for something else. After breakfast, he put on his hat. "I ride the fence line on Wednesdays," he said. "I will be gone until supper. Bram is at the sheep camp. You will have the house to yourself." "Thank you." There is a pantry off the kitchen, a cellar beneath. The upstairs closet holds linen. You should feel free to open any door. This is your home now. He met her eyes when he said it. She could not tell whether the sentence was an invitation or a test. "Thank you, Edward," he nodded and went out. She stood at the kitchen window and watched him ride out along the ridge. He sat a horse well, straight and easy, and he did not look back at the house. When he had crested the low rise and passed beyond it, she counted slowly to 200, and then she went through the house. She was thorough. She had done this in 5 other houses. She opened the pantry and read the labels on the tin boxes. She lifted the corners of the parlor rug and looked at the boards beneath. She went down into the cellar with a candle and inventoried the shelves. Preserved peaches, salt beef, a crock of lard, a small locked chest at the back, which she did not disturb. She saved the upstairs for last. His room. The wardrobe. The small writing desk under the west window. The writing desk was locked. She stood a long moment looking at it. Then she went back downstairs to fetch a hairpin. The desk was walnut, with a slanted lid and a small brass keyhole above the drawer. It was old, older than the house itself, the kind of piece a man brought west because it had belonged to his father or his grandfather and was too full of ballast to leave behind. Elizabeth knelt on the boards in front of it and took the hairpin between her teeth and bent it into the shape she wanted. She had learned this in Nebraska. Her second husband had kept his cash in a locked drop front, and she had spent the long afternoons of that marriage teaching herself to open it without leaving marks. She had improved since. The Halton desk gave up its lock in under a minute. She lifted the slanted lid. Inside, the desk was neat. A green blotter, an inkwell of blue glass, 3 steel pens in a china tray, a small stack of writing paper. She lifted the paper and found beneath it a bundle of documents tied with a length of black cotton tape. She untied the tape. The first document was a newspaper clipping. She recognized it before she read a word of it, the way a woman recognizes her own handwriting across a dark room. It was from the Kansas City Star, dated April of 1881. The obituary of Mr. James Corley, druggist, aged 41, of a sudden weakness of the heart. The clipping had been cut cleanly, with scissors, and mounted on a stiff card. On the back of the card, in a small precise hand that was not her own, someone had written, "C. arrived Kansas City March 4. Married J.C. March 22. J.C. deceased April 9. C. departed for St. Joseph April 24. Estate, $1140. Pharmacy purchase, tincture of aconite March 30. Druggist Bryson, receipt filed." She sat back on her heels. The second document was another clipping. Indiana, her third husband, Mr. Hollis Weir. The card behind it bore the same careful handwriting, the same austere accounting of dates and dollars and pharmacies. The third document was Missouri. The fourth was Iowa. The fifth was Nebraska. And it went back to her second husband, before Kansas, before Mr. Corley, whose name she still traveled under. There were, in total, 5 clippings. Beneath the clippings was a bound notebook. She opened it. The first page was a list of train schedules, west to east across 5 states, annotated in the same hand. The second page was a list of pharmacies and druggists, with dates and, in several cases, small notations like cash paid, no ledger or ledger torn, page 44. The third page began a set of what she understood, slowly, to be probate records. Her husband's probate records, what each estate had contained and what had passed to her. She read her own name written down 5 times in another person's hand and felt the small hairs rise along her forearms. She did not panic. She had trained herself out of panic long ago. She turned the pages of the notebook methodically, one after another, until she reached a page dated 3 years earlier, on which the first entry read, Portland Oregonian, matrimonial column, October 1886. First advertisement placed. E. H. E. H. Edward Halton. The advertisement she had answered in July had been placed by Edward 3 years ago and replaced each season since, and she had walked into it by her own free choice, having read it on a table in a boarding house in Sacramento and thought it sounded promising. Elizabeth closed the notebook. She sat for a long time on the floor of Edward's room, listening to the wind in the foxglove downstairs. She did not put the notebook back at once. She held it flat in her lap and let herself think. The obvious thing was that Edward was a lawman. A Pinkerton, perhaps, or a private agent hired by one of the families of the deceased. She turned that over and set it aside. A Pinkerton would not have built a ranch. A Pinkerton would not have painted a house white and planted foxglove and waited 3 years, placing and replacing the same advertisement in a Portland paper on the chance that a certain widow, reading it in a boarding house 2 states away, would answer. The next possibility was that Edward was a relative of one of the dead men. A brother. A grown son. Someone who had loved a man she had married and who wanted, at long last, to look at her across a table before he decided what to do. She considered the 5 names in the notebook: Corley, Weir, Ansell, Mattingly, Braithwaite. She thought about their faces, what she could still remember of them. None of them had spoken of an Edward. None of them had spoken of a brother or a cousin in Oregon. She considered a third possibility, which was that Edward was a private lunatic who had built a fantasy around her the way lonely men in remote country sometimes built fantasies around actresses or opera singers, and that the whole ranch was an elaborate stage set to attract her here for some end she could not yet name. She looked around the room. It did not have the feel of a stage set. It had the feel of a house that a man had lived in for many years, alone, with a small monomania in a locked desk that he opened perhaps twice a month to add a line. None of the 3 possibilities accounted for the sentence he had spoken in the parlor the night before. A widow whose circumstances suggested she might understand mine. She turned back to the notebook. She read more slowly now. She had missed something on the first pass because she had been reading for danger. She read this time for the man himself. The handwriting was educated. The abbreviations were the abbreviations of someone who had kept ledgers. On several pages, the margins held small notes that were not accountings at all, but observations. C. Does not stay in a town more than 14 weeks before the funeral. C. Always sends the trunk ahead by rail. C. Wears mourning for 8 weeks precisely, no more. One of the notes near the back reads C. Reads the local paper every morning before breakfast. She looks for her own name. He had watched her. Not in person. He had watched her at a distance of 5 states and 3 years, through paper, through the residue she left behind. And he had learned her the way another man might learn a species of bird. There was no anger in the notes. There was no gloating. There was, if she read them fairly, a kind of attentiveness that in another context she might have called respect. She turned to the last page of the notebook. There was only one line there, dated the previous month. She will come in September. The room is ready. The foxglove is in. Elizabeth read it twice. Then she closed the notebook and retied the black cotton tape and laid the bundle back exactly as she had found it. She closed the desk. She wedged the hairpin back into the shape of a hairpin and slid it into her pocket. She went downstairs. She washed her hands at the kitchen pump for a long time. Then she began, without hurry, to prepare supper. She made a chicken. She had bought it live from Mrs. Dell the day of the wedding, and it had been hanging plucked and cold in the cellar since. She cut it into 8 pieces and browned it in the heavy iron skillet and made a gravy with flour and cream. She peeled potatoes. She snapped the last of the green beans from the kitchen garden and cooked them with a rasher of bacon. She set the table in the dining room with the good cloth, because it was still their first week, and it seemed important to keep the shape of the thing. She did not add anything to the food. She had considered it, standing at the stove with the skillet hissing, and had put the thought away with the same deliberate motion she used to close a drawer. If she had misread the notebook, poisoning Edward tonight would answer a question no one had yet asked. If she had read it correctly. Poisoning Edward tonight would be a discourtesy of a kind she did not wish to commit against a man who had prepared a room for her and planted foxglove in September, and written she will come in a neat hand across a page in a locked desk. She wanted first to hear him speak. Edward came in at dusk. He hung his hat on the peg by the door and washed at the basin on the porch and came into the dining room in his shirt sleeves. He had been in the wind all day, and there was color high in his cheeks. He looked at the table and at her and said, "This is a great deal of trouble." "It is our first proper supper," she said. "I wanted it done properly. Thank you." They sat down across from each other. He said grace in the same low voice he had used for his vows. He ate slowly and with evident appreciation. He complimented the gravy. He asked whether she had made bread. She said she had, and fetched it from the sideboard, wrapped in a clean towel. He tore a piece and buttered it and ate. "You went through the house today," he said. She did not answer at once. She set down her fork. "You said I might." "I did." He took a sip of coffee. "I meant it. I only observed that you had." The rug in the parlor was laid back a little crooked. "I am usually more careful. You were in a hurry today." "That is understandable." She looked at him across the table. His face held the same composed attention she had seen there since the coach set her down. He was not angry. He was not triumphant. He was, she thought, a man who had rehearsed this evening as carefully as he had rehearsed the sentence in the parlor the night before, and who now was watching to see whether she would meet him halfway. "Edward." "Yes, I found the desk." He nodded once, as though a small transaction had closed. "I hoped you would." "You hoped. I did not want to be the one to open it. It seemed important that you find it yourself." She let a long breath out. "Then you should tell me who you are." "I have told you who I am. My name is Edward Halton. I ran cattle for 20 years east of here and sheep for the last 10. I was married once. My wife died in 1873. How?" He set his cup down carefully. "I would rather show you than say it," he said. "After we finish supper, if you will permit me, I will bring something in from the parlor." They finished the meal in a quiet that was not quite a silence. Edward asked her about the potatoes, where she had learned to season them so, and she told him a truth, which was that she had learned it in Iowa from the hired girl of her fourth husband. He did not flinch at the mention of the fourth husband. He nodded, the way a man nods when a piece fits into a place he had already prepared for it. When the plates were cleared, he asked her to sit in the parlor. He carried in the coffee service himself. He set it on the small round table by the fire, and then he went out and came back with a wooden box the size of a family Bible, and he set that on the table too. He poured her a cup. He poured himself one. "Elizabeth," he said. It was the first time he had used her Christian name. "Yes, my wife's name was Marta. She was 31 years old. We had been married 9 years. There were no children. In the spring of 1873, she began to complain of a weakness in her hands, and by summer she could not lift a kettle, and by September she was dead. The doctor called it a nervous decline. He was a country doctor, and he had no better name for it. I buried her behind the first house I built, which stood 12 miles from here, and burned down in 1878. He paused. He turned the cup in his hands. "I did not suspect anything for 2 years. I did not have the imagination for it. I had married her out of a mail column, as I married you, and I had loved her, in my way, and I did not think of her death as anything but a private grief. Then, in 1875, I read in the Portland Oregonian the obituary of a druggist in Walla Walla, whose young wife had come to him out of a matrimonial advertisement 6 months before, and who had died of a nervous weakness at the age of 43. The wife had inherited his shop and had sold it and departed for California. Something in the account made me set the paper down." Elizabeth watched his hands. "I made inquiries. Not many. I was not then a man who knew how to make inquiries. I wrote a letter to the doctor in Walla Walla. He answered. I wrote another to the pharmacist who had filled the household prescriptions. He answered as well. Certain names appeared in both letters, and one of them was the name of a preparation that Marta had used, in small doses in the last months of her life, for what she and I both believed to be a woman's complaint. He opened the wooden box. Inside, laid on a bed of green baize, were 5 gold wedding bands. They were of varying weights and finishes. One was very plain. One was engraved on the inner face. One had a small stone missing from a setting where a stone had been. He did not touch them. He simply turned the box so that she could see. "These are not accusations," he said. "I am not a lawman. I am not a brother. I am a man who lost his wife in a particular way in 1873 and who has spent 16 years trying to understand how a person arrives at the state of mind in which such a thing becomes possible. I did not build this ranch to trap you. I built it so that when you came, we might sit together in a warm room, and you might tell me." Elizabeth looked at the rings. She looked at Edward. "Tell you what," she said, very softly. "How you became who you are," he said. "I have not been able to arrive at it on my own." For a long time she did not speak. The fire moved in the stove. Somewhere in the barn a horse blew out through its nose, and the wind that had been steady all day dropped for a moment and then took up again, thinner, along the eaves. She thought about lying to him. She could still, at this moment, put on her face the composed astonishment of an innocent woman and say she did not know what he meant, that these clippings were coincidences. That grief made ruin of men's judgment, and he had built a private theory around her that was without foundation. And would he be so kind as to arrange a wagon to Baker City in the morning? She had made such speeches before. She had made one to a doctor in Iowa in 1886 that had turned him from the door and saved her a great deal of trouble. She knew the shape of the sentences. She looked at Edward's face. He was watching her with the patient attention of a man who had waited 16 years for a conversation and was prepared to wait a little longer if he must, and who would not be fooled by a speech. "I was 17, she said. Edward set down his cup. He did not move otherwise. "I was 17. And I was married to a man in southern Illinois whose name I do not use anymore and will not say tonight. He was 42. He drank. He broke my arm in the second year of the marriage and my collarbone in the third. I could not go home because my father had died and my mother had remarried a man who did not want me. I had no money of my own. In the fourth year I found, in the barn, a tin of paste that the hired man used for the rats. I read the label. I thought about it for a long time. I did not use it that season. I used it the next." She stopped. "He was buried in Marion County in the spring of 1878. The doctor called it a weakness of the stomach. I inherited 80 acres and a team of mules, and I sold both, and I went west. And then I found that I could do it. That was the discovery. I had thought before that a person did such a thing once, in an extremity, and afterward returned to being who they had been. I found instead that I had become someone else, and that the someone else was capable and calm, and not afraid of very much. I married a man in Nebraska because he had a good farm and a bad temper, and I buried him. And then I married a man in Kansas because he had a pharmacy, and I wanted to be near the shelves. And I buried him. And then I did not stop." "You could have stopped." "Yes, why did you not?" She considered this honestly. She had never been asked before. "Because no one had ever asked me to," she said. "And because after the second one I was no longer certain that stopping was available to me. It is difficult to explain. I think a person who has done a thing 5 times is a different creature from a person who has done it once. And the difference is not repentance or its absence. It is that the thing has become the shape of the days." Edward nodded slowly. "That is close to what I suspected," he said. "Suspected?" "Of the woman who killed my wife." She lifted her head. "You believe the same woman killed Marta?" "No," Edward said. "I know she did not. Marta died in 1873. You were 15 years old and living in Illinois. The woman who killed Marta was someone else. I have been looking for her too." Elizabeth set her cup down. For the first time since she had opened the desk that afternoon, she felt the room move a little around her, the way a room moves when a person stands too quickly. "Someone else. Yes, you have been looking for a different woman. And you brought me here." "I brought you here," Edward said, "because you are the only woman I have been able to find in 16 years who has done what she did in a manner I recognize. I do not know the woman who killed Marta. I do not know her name. I do not know what state she is in now, or whether she is still living. I have followed her at a distance in newspapers for a long time, and the trail is cold, and I have come to believe that I will not find her by following her. I thought I might learn to find her by understanding you. That is a strange sentence. It is. You wish to learn, she said slowly, how such a person thinks, so that you can recognize the other one when you see her. Yes. And when you find her? Edward looked into his cup. He did not answer at once. I have thought about that for 16 years, he said, and I have not yet arrived at a settled answer. I did not think I would need one until I was closer. What I know is that I would like, before I die, to sit across a table from her and to hear her say what you have just said to me. That is all I have known clearly. The rest I have left to be decided in its season. And I am practice. That is not how I would phrase it. How would you phrase it? He set the cup down. You are the first person I have spoken to in 16 years who understands the question. I have carried it alone. I do not any longer wish to carry it alone. I would like, if you will permit it, to carry it with you. In exchange, I offer you what I think you have not had before, which is a house in which you may sit down and not need to leave in 14 weeks. I offer you a name that will not be inherited by anyone. I offer you a man who knows already the worst of what you are, and who does not require you to pretend otherwise across a breakfast table for the rest of a long marriage. She was quiet for a while. You are not afraid of me. No, you should be. Perhaps I have considered it. I have decided that the risk of you is smaller than the certainty of another 16 years alone. Edward, yes, I have not been offered anything before that I did not have to earn by a funeral. I know. I do not know how to accept it. You accept it, he said, by staying, and by not doing to me what you did to the others. That is the whole of the contract. There is no other clause. She looked at the 5 rings in the box between them. She looked at the fire. She looked at Edward. And when we find her, she said, the other one. If we find her. If we find her. What if she is not, as you say, someone who will sit across a table and speak? What if she is not tired, as I am tired? What if she does not wish to be found? Edward closed the lid of the box. Then, he said, we will consider, together, what a person like you and a person like me may do about a person like her. But not tonight. He rose and banked the fire. She did not leave the east room that night, and Edward did not ask her to. He wished her good night at the top of the stairs, as he had done every night since the wedding, and she heard his door close, and she lay a long time in the dark, listening to the house settle around her. She had never, in 5 marriages, slept in a house that felt like this one. It was not that it was safe. She did not think safety was the correct word. It was that she was, for the first time she could remember, not required to lie about anything at all. She slept, in the end, hard and without dreams. In the morning she came down and made breakfast, and Edward came in from the barn, and they ate. He asked whether she would ride out with him along the fence line that afternoon. She said she would. He gave her a pair of leather gloves that had belonged to Marta, which he had kept in a drawer of the sideboard, and she put them on and found that they fit. The winter came, and the winter passed. She learned the ranch. She learned the sheep, which she had not expected to like, and found she liked very well. She learned the Basque phrases Bram used to the dogs, and she taught herself to bake bread the way it was baked in this country, in a Dutch oven set in the coals, because the cook stove in the kitchen did not brown a crust to her satisfaction. She wrote to no one. She received no letters. She kept, at Edward's request, the notebook from the desk, and in the long evenings she added to it, in her own hand now, the things she remembered that he had not been able to learn from clippings. She did not enjoy writing them. She wrote them anyway. It seemed a fair price. Mrs. Dell came often that first winter. She never suspected anything. She said only that Mrs. Halton had put color into the house that had not been there in years, and that Edward was a different man than he had been the winter before. Elizabeth thanked her and cut her a slice of cake and asked after her sons. In the spring, a letter came from a doctor in eastern Washington in answer to one Edward had written the previous fall. A widow had arrived in his town in November, and married the proprietor of a livery stable in January, and the proprietor had died in March of a nervous weakness of the heart. And the widow had sold the stable and departed for Spokane. The doctor gave her name as Mrs. Alma Rennett. He gave a description. He gave the date of her train. Edward read the letter twice at the breakfast table and then handed it across to Elizabeth without speaking. She read it once. She folded it. She set it beside her plate. "Well," she said. "Yes. That is a beginning. It is." He poured her more coffee. She took the letter up again and looked at the description and thought about a woman on a train to Spokane who did not know this morning that she had been noticed. Outside, the foxglove along the walk was beginning to come back, pale green shoots pushing through the last of the mud, and the ridge above the house was showing brown where the snow had gone. Elizabeth folded the letter a second time and put it in the pocket of her apron. "Finish your breakfast," she said to Edward. "We have a great deal to consider." He smiled his small closed smile, and he did.